Hello, everybody, and good afternoon to Repro Action's May webinar. What is abortion abolition and why does it matter? Alrighty, so I will first dive in to introduce myself and my co-host. So my name is Jessica Ensley. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Senior VP of Outreach at Repro Action, and I am based in Washington, D.C., and I will pass it over to my co-host for today, Nagar.
Hey everyone, my name is Nagar. I use she or they pronouns. I am the Senior Manager of Tactical Research here at Repro Action, and I am based in Brooklyn, New York.
Thank you. So here's an overview of our agenda. I will go ahead and introduce our organization before passing it over to Negi to talk about today's topic, and then we will dive into our panel discussion before we head on to some housekeeping items and then some Q&A. If folks have any questions, while we are going through today's topic, please feel free to enter them in the chat and we will get to them at the Q&A section. And you can join our conversation by live posting with the hashtag ReproAction on Blue Sky and follow us along there. So with that, I will pass it over. I'll introduce our org. Repro Action leads bold action to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We are known for our left flank analysis, our willingness to hold folks on all sides accountable, whether they be allies or opposition, and a commitment to nonviolent direct action. Alrighty, and then with that, I will now pass it over to my co-host, Nikki. You can take it from here.
Awesome. Okay, so first I will go through a little bit of an intro. So what is an abortion abolitionist and why do they call themselves that? I think most people, hopefully, know the term abolitionist as it's associated with the abolition of slavery and Black liberation movements. But there is a sect of anti-abortion activists that do not call themselves pro-life, very staunch on not referring that as that to themselves. And they are basically very extremist absolutists that believe abortion should be criminalized with no exceptions. So no exceptions for the life of the pregnant person, but the criminalization of anybody who has an abortion. It's often associated with really fundamentalist Christian groups. So many of the organizations have ties with churches, ministries that also follow the same philosophy as them. And as it might make sense based on this description, they are definitely against incrementalism and reform. So I think sometimes with anti-abortion activists in the mainstream, so organizations we know rather than this smaller sect, they can advocate for a consensus on anti-abortion legislation or trying to inch towards progress. And these abortion abolitionists are completely against that. They are a very all or nothing approach, and very also vocally against that approach on social media towards other mainstream anti-abortion activists, especially lately with a lot of fetal personhood bills going around, and I'll get into that on the next slide. And as you can imagine, this rhetoric is appropriated from the movement to abolish slavery. There is a scholar named Deborah Threedy that first examined this in 1994, so it's definitely not a new phenomenon, but it has been gaining visibility in the last couple years, especially after the Dobbs decision. So they kind of use the Dobbs decision and Roe v. Wade to compare it to Dred Scott versus Sanford. So in that decision, basically the Supreme Court views it as a stain on history, if you will, for legitimizing the institution of slavery. So abortion abolitionists view Roe v. Wade as the same thing. Essentially, they think and try to peddle the narrative that Roe v. Wade in X amount of years, 100 years, 50 years, will hold the same stigma as the Dred Scott decision, and we don't want to be a mark on history that we've already made in the past. So it's definitely trying to twist these liberation narratives to fit their own agenda, and also try to take advantage of legal decisions and happenings that have been in the last few years fueling their own rhetoric. So we can go to the next slide. And so fetal personhood, which I mentioned, this is a very important concept to their values because it is the idea that embryos and fetuses should have equal protection under law the same way born people, so us, real people, do. And that means that they want to treat abortion as homicide. So anybody who has an abortion, anybody who assists in providing an abortion, whether that's a provider, a physical physician, or somebody who even drove somebody to an appointment to have an abortion, those people would all be criminalized if this sect of activists had their way. And this logic is based off of the 14th Amendment, which conferred citizenship and equal rights to enslaved people. So they use that same narrative and rhetoric to say, well, why aren't fetuses also included in this citizenship and equal rights institution? And so basically they're equating the concepts of abortion and slavery, and sometimes even they will go as far as saying that abortion is worse than slavery. They're based usually in, as you can imagine, non-scientific claims and very much connected to morality based on religion. And this has mostly come up in the last or the last year, as abortion abolitionists have kind of infiltrated or at least expressed their policy goals more loudly in local and national legislatures. So this Life at Conception Act is kind of used in different legislations that are aimed at gaining fetal personhood in the whether it's in the Senate of a state, or they are trying to lobby for a politician to kind of glom on to this with them, and it usually is the same base language, and there are some particular lawmakers that they already kind of have in their pocket, and we'll also talk about that in a bit with one of our panelists. But this also heavily affects people who experience miscarriages, ectopic pregnancies, that might have an abortion because of these circumstances. But because these abortion abolitionists view the institution as very extreme, and it's a black and white kind of concept to them. There's no gray area. Whereas some, or most actually, mainstream anti-abortion activists will either not state explicitly their stance on criminalizing abortion, or they will be very vague about it. It can be contentious with their own values of inching towards progress and inching towards their goals incrementally, rather than this all or nothing approach that abortion abolitionists try to enforce. So we can go to the next slide. And so I kind of talked about this a little bit, but how are these two groups different from each other? They very often clash over social media, publicly, over anti-abortion activists of the mainstream. So, we're talking the Students for Life of America, Susan B. Anthony. They're not extreme enough in their views and what they advocate for in legislation and also grassroots movements. They are very vocal about not making these compromises on their beliefs and their platform, and they will go after quote unquote pro-life organizations that oppose their bills for whatever reason. So it might be there's a bill that explicitly criminalizes anybody who has an abortion, and let's say a mainstream organization like Students for Life lobbies against that, or even just implies that that's not something they support. Mainly on X, or formerly Twitter, these abortion abolitionists will pile on to these figures and leaders of the anti-abortion movement that they see as separate from themselves, to kind of peddle the narrative that they are actually not anti-abortion and they are trying to keep abortion legal. In fact, this happened most recently in Texas, where there was a Life and Conception Act, and Texas Alliance for Life was very much against that, and there have been a lot of abortion abolitionists, whether it's organizations or prominent leaders in their movement, trying to, again, make it seem like the goals they have are very different and that they're against each other, rather than them trying to achieve the same thing. So for us, we see them as similar, obviously, because at the end of the day, they have the same goal, but they view their methods as superior, and it's almost seen as a kind of identity for them to call themselves an abortion abolitionists. And they view being anti-abortion in the way that mainstream organizations like Students for Life or Live Action are mainly rooted in a stance, and that's not really their identity, because they're not dedicated enough to have this be part of their core moral philosophy. So we are joined by two really awesome folks that we will get to chat with. So I'll pass it over to Jessica.
Great. Thank you, Nagar. That was a really wonderful overview of what we've been dealing with. Yeah, I am very pleased to introduce our first panelist. Madeline Gomez is the Senior Policy Counsel at Planned Parenthood Federation of America, and she uses she, her pronouns. Madeline advises on a range of proactive and defensive policy matters related to sexual and reproductive health care in all 50 states. In prior roles, Madeline has litigated reproductive rights and other matters in federal and state courts, and she began her career as an If, When, How federal policy fellow at the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice. She earned a JD from Columbia Law School and a BA from New York University. And though she is based in Brooklyn, she considers herself a Texan at home. Madeline, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Great. My first question for you is, what do you think is important for our movement to know about abortion, abolitionists, and fetal personhood?
Sure. So there are three things that really come to mind. The first is that this isn't new. I've seen a lot of media, particularly in the last few months, pose abortion abolition, or the folks who are pushing for abolition as a sort of rising fringe, and there's a lot of air quotes there. But a faction of abortion opponents has advanced for legal rights of fetuses and embryos since Roe was first decided. And even though there's a faction that is perhaps more extreme or less wavering on their willingness to criminalize pregnant people in particular, or call abortion homicide. The truth is that the idea that fetuses should have legal rights, that a fetus or an embryo deserves more protection than a pregnant person, that idea is at the heart of the anti-abortion movement, whether we're talking about mainstream organizations, and again, I'm putting mainstream in quotes, or this sort of different, more extreme faction. It is true that recently abortion abolitionists have become louder, they've become more brazen, and they are getting more attention. But I think it's important that we keep in mind that whether we're talking about an abortion ban or a bill that calls abortion homicide, we're talking about laws that allow for, even if not explicitly, or enable the criminalization of pregnant people, and that punish pregnant people, again, whether we're talking about criminal penalties or just putting their lives at risk. So there's sort of two sides of a similar coin. And then the second thing is that, relatedly, we shouldn't treat those who oppose abortion as a monolith. Of course, especially when we're talking about politics and policy work, we are often trying to get the other side to come to an agreement to defeat bad bills or to pass good legislation. But I also want to be careful that we not minimize the influence of abolitionists by sort of treating them as fringe extremists who don't have power. They do have power in the anti-abortion movement, and the more quote unquote mainstream organizations are happy to use the fringe as a tactic in these political battles. And then the third thing, I think it's just worth repeating over and over and over again, that abortion abolition is an unpopular stance. It is not popular, again, among lawmakers. It's not popular among the general public, certainly. We know that the majority of people support abortion access, oppose continued restrictions, oppose the bans. We've seen that over and over again at the ballot. We're seeing it in polling. We know that people support access to abortion. They oppose the continued restrictions on abortion. And so while we have to hold the truth that this more extreme faction has a lot of power and will continue to push for the vision of the world that they want, we have the popular support of the public, and I think the right side of history on our side. So we can't sort of allow ourselves to move that line.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for breaking that out into those three very digestible points. And I mean, absolutely on your last point, it is true. And we've seen this across the board in many different ways, from studies, of course, to ballot measures that have passed, that fetal personhood and abortion abolition is extremely unpopular. Um, and of course, these organizations have very similarly been working alongside each other for many years or have contacts with legislators. While we are seeing, I think, more coverage of this rise of abortion abolitionists, and now we're seeing, I guess, quote unquote, more mainstream anti-abortion organizations starting to take on those abolitionist talking points now that Roe is defeated. I wanted to ask you, how has this, I guess, visible rise of abortion abolitionists affected your work?
Sure. So again, I think there are a couple of different ways. The first is just in terms of policy, right? So my work is primarily on legislative policy. We have seen an increased number of pieces of legislation that would either criminalize pregnant people by removing current protections in abortion bans. And when I talk about protections in abortion bans, I want to be really careful here that I be clear about what I mean. I mean language in an abortion ban that says a pregnant person cannot be criminalized or penalized for seeking an abortion. Now, realistically, we know that pregnant people do face criminalization, that that you don't actually need a specific abortion ban in the state code to criminalize pregnant people. There are a lot of different provisions that are used for that. But it is this sort of language that says this specific provision that bans abortion cannot be used to penalize the pregnant person is fairly standard language that we've seen in bans passed throughout the country. And we're seeing legislation that would pull out that language or that would introduce a new ban that doesn't include that language. We're also seeing increased legislation that would treat abortion as homicide, that would change the definition of homicide in a state code, either to say this does include abortion or to repeal language that says this doesn't include abortion, or to redefine a person to include a fetus or embryo in the code, which would mean that anytime the state code says, you know, killing a person is a crime, effectively, I'm paraphrasing, of course, that would include an embryo or a fetus without sort of any exception for abortion. So we're seeing more of that. We're also then seeing more legislation that would threaten or criminalize people who support patients seeking abortion. So abortion funds, people who are helping to navigate patients out of state to get care. Even in some states, people, providers who are referring for abortion out of state. So that is all an effort to, again, treat abortion not just as criminal, but as, you know, as homicide, as sort of what we think of often as like the worst crimes, and to penalize anyone associated with it, including the pregnant person. So just to sort of put some numbers to that, this year, when I talk about removing that exception or the carve out to not penalize a pregnant person, we saw 7 bills in states that would make that particular move. That's up from like 2 or 3 that we've seen in past years. We saw 13 bills that would treat abortion as homicide and penalize it as such. Last year, we saw only 3 bills introduced with that language. And then we saw 12 bills this year that would create threats for people that provide support and help. So this is all sort of, we used to see these bills and sort of they were treated as, you know, fringe or extreme, or they weren't going to move anywhere. No one was going to talk about them. It was sort of a one-off legislator doing this. But we're seeing them increasingly throughout states, and more of them, which I think again points to the way that the Overton window can shift and these things can become more normalized. The more you see it, the more people start to think maybe there's something reasonable here, even though we know, of course, that there's not. The other thing that this does in terms of policy is it changes the dynamics in legislative fights. So sometimes it changes those dynamics in ways that we can exploit. We can sort of fight the factions against each other. We can delay, we can create confusion, and it can work to our benefit that folks are not in agreement about just which way they want to be cruel. But in the long term, it makes our work harder. And that's what I mentioned, that we see these quote unquote mainstream anti-abortion organizations use the fringe to further their agenda. One thing that is very common is that you will see a bill introduced with the most extreme provisions without protections for a pregnant person from being, criminalized. You will see the personhood language sort of throughout the bill, and then rather than just not move the bill forward, you'll see amendments made to make it sort of more, again, quote unquote, reasonable, or to supposedly compromise by pulling out these things that really shouldn't have ever been introduced in a bill at all. And so then you have a total abortion ban, but it doesn't have personhood language. And so that's supposed to be a compromise, even though we know that a ban is going to have horrific effects on people's lives. And that, I think, is how it sort of makes our work harder, by making things that are beyond the pale seem somehow acceptable. And then the other two things that I want to say in terms of the way that the rising visibility has affected my work, and I think also just our lives, in a post-Dobbs society, is there is a lot of fear and confusion. I know sort of in this particular federal administration, we've seen folks pulling back from enforcing the FACE Act. In fact, a lot of people, released, or a lot of FACE Act prosecutions dropped entirely. That creates a lot of fear for providers and for patients. There is a real concern, I think, about patient and provider safety. And then there's just increased stigma. The folks who are making decisions for their lives and their futures should be able to do that without the sort of vitriolic language that we hear coming out of abortion abolitionists. And that is, I think, especially painful when it's your state or federal representatives talking about you, a person who is making the best choice you can for your life and your family, and you have your legislative leader talking about you as being a murderer. That's painful. It's callous, and it does affect, I think, the way that people are able to move in this world, knowing that the choices that you've made are so heavily stigmatized, and that there is this, again, sort of louder outcry. It's really emboldening people, I think, who oppose abortion to pursue that in ways that are unsafe.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that thorough response. And I think it's really helpful for our attendees here too, to understand that, like you said, this language is being presented as an extreme. So then when other anti-abortion activists come in, they seem much more, I guess, quote unquote, reasonable. And I think that's really important to keep in mind here as we talk about this topic. Madeline, thank you so much for answering my questions, and we will be able to come back to you for more of your expertise during the Q&A section.
Sure.
All right, thank you. And I, with that, will pass it over to Nikki to introduce our next panelist.
Great, thank you so much, Madeline. So our next panelist is Cindy Nguyen, and she is the policy director at the ACLU of Oklahoma. She uses she, her pronouns. She is the affiliate's lead lobbyist at the state capitol on issues related to reproductive freedom, to LGBTQ+ rights, criminal legal reform, immigration, and free speech. She has previously served as the Director of Social and Economic Justice at YWCA Oklahoma City, working with survivors of intimate partner violence and training organizations on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in 2019, Cindy created the Asian Task Force of Oklahoma to address anti-Asian discrimination and gender-based violence in Oklahoma's AAPI communities. She is an unapologetic advocate for all with a career devoted to serving marginalized communities. So thank you so much for joining us, Cindy.
Thank you so much, Nagar. And can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I hear you. Thank you.
Perfect.
So my first question to you is, how have abortion abolitionists affected local organizing and legislatures in Oklahoma and your work?
Great question. Oklahoma tends to be the testing ground for pretty egregious pieces of legislation that impacts all of our civil rights and liberties. But we can get started on where the abolitionist movement began in Oklahoma itself. So in Norman, Oklahoma in 2011, there was a group that was founded called the Human Abortion, or AHA. It wasn't just another anti-abortion organization. It was a complete rejection against what the founders saw as failures in the mainstream pro-life movement. They saw that the pro-life movement believed in incremental restrictions like waiting periods and gestational limits, but they saw this as not only insufficient, but immoral itself. For the abolitionists, anything that was short of a full abolition of abortion, including criminal penalties for everybody involved, including the abortion patient, was completely unacceptable. Which brings me to their core idea, and it sets them apart from Oklahomans for Life, which is the long considered mainstream face of anti-abortion activism in the state. AHA did not want to compromise. They didn't want exceptions. They do not believe in political strategies that chipped away at abortion rights over time. They wanted to define abortion as homicide, and they wanted to have people prosecuted, including pregnant people themselves. So it's led to this deep and ongoing divide in the anti-abortion movement in Oklahoma and nationwide, one that it has very serious consequences that we have seen in Oklahoma in the way that anti-abortion legislation is being written and pushed nationally. So if we look at this on the local level, in the early days, the AHA was considered too fringe to be even taken seriously. There was only one Oklahoma state senator that would even associate themselves with them. But that has quickly changed. They now have allies in both chambers of the state legislature here. And even more concerning is that they're not just influencing policy from the outside, they are running for and winning offices in Oklahoma. Their tactics are aggressive, confrontational, and oftentimes harassing. They have protested at churches, including conservative and inclusive congregations. They have protested at public schools that the lawmakers' children go to. They have also showed up at GOP meetings where they know that they can embarrass conservative lawmakers in front of their colleagues. Just recently this year, when we had 4 Republican Oklahoma lawmakers vote no on an abolitionist bill in committee, the abolitionist members showed up at their churches the next day and their GOP meetings to confront them directly, and they held protests outside the churches and public schools. This is not advocacy, it is straight up intimidation. And unfortunately, it's working. In 2025, there were 13 abolitionist bills that we saw from across the country that were introduced. This includes legislation in states to charge patients who have abortions with first-degree murder, a charge that can carry the death penalty in a state like Oklahoma. So we are seeing that it's not just a symbolic symbol, that these bills just isn't something that is symbolic or designed to send a message, that these are real legislative efforts that, if passed, could have catastrophic consequences for reproductive freedom and criminal legal reform as a whole. And while we have not yet seen success in passing any of these extreme laws, thankfully, we know that their influence is unmistakable. Legislators who oppose them have to deal with the consequences of opposing them. They have to deal with these abolitionists showing up to their places of worship, to their kids' school, to their GOP meetings. They have to face the harassment and the pressure of voting no and standing up. And unfortunately, in a state like Oklahoma, where political primaries are often even more important than general elections here, their extremist positions tend to be gaining traction within the Republican Party base itself and pulling the entire party to the right.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That is definitely a lot of detail that I think even the articles that we have from local news sources don't have as many specifics. So my next question for you is, how do you view the comparison of abortion abolitionists' impact on a national versus local level, since you are plugged into a local sphere?
Absolutely. So in Oklahoma, they are incredibly savvy organizers. Groups like Abolitionist Rising, which is the main national group, or the national extension of the AHA movement from Norman that we just discussed. They are using social media. They're effectively mobilizing quickly and loudly. They can get a ton of people together to show up in person at the state capitol to follow legislators around and harass them. Their messaging tends to be absolutist, rooted in a lot of religious fervor, and it is designed to appeal to people who feel that the country has essentially lost its way. So it leads me to the national picture compared to Oklahoma. So in our own tracker, we have seen since 2017, and especially after the overturning of Roe in 2022, we saw that abortion abolitionist bills have been introduced in at least 21 different states. So I think one of the most important things to note from this is that the end of Roe did not satisfy these abolitionists. In fact, it empowered them. So while there are some mainstream anti-abortion movements that really celebrated sending abortion back to the states, abolitionists saw it as a green light to go even further, to not just ban abortion, but to criminalize in the most extreme way possible nationwide. And we are continuously seeing them clash with mainstream anti-abortion groups. They are pulling the entire movement to the right. What was considered politically toxic back then, such as calling for the prosecution of abortion patients for homicide and essentially charging people with the death penalty, is now being debated in state houses across the country. So we are seeing this no longer be a fringe problem. It is a growing national threat with deep local roots, like in Oklahoma and Norman, Oklahoma, because we know it's often used as a testing ground. So what does this really mean for us, for those who continue to be committed to the reproductive freedom movement and justice? First, I would really say we can't afford to underestimate these extremists or dismiss them as too radical, because they are succeeding in Oklahoma and other states, and other state houses just like ours. Not always by passing laws, but by shifting the conversation by intimidating lawmakers and forcing their vision into policy debates that make it into news reports. So now households are now discussing this on the local level. Second, I think we need to understand that local elections really do matter. These movements gain power by one school board, one city council, one state legislative seat at a time, and stopping them really means organizing locally and supporting candidates who are willing to fight back.
Thank you so much for that deep dive. That is really helpful context to have. And you talked a little bit about this, but are there specific examples of abortion abolitionists clashing with these more mainstream, quote unquote, pro-life activists that have impacted your work the most?
Absolutely. There are several, but I know we don't have 10 hours to discuss all of them, but I think what's especially dangerous is that the abolitionists are rejecting all forms of incremental legislation. So if we are seeing a bill that limits abortion at 6 weeks, but it doesn't ban it outright, we are seeing abolitionists oppose it. And they will attack the lawmakers who back it. So they are, again, showing up in person to these state houses to protest these lawmakers that are voting for these kinds of restrictions. So it's kind of odd in that sometimes you see a legislator vote against a certain thing or for it, and you are assuming it might be for a good reason, and then you realize that it is because the abolitionists are against it. And a lot of times abolitionist organizers do not care about optics. They do not really care much for electability. They care about one thing, and that is the total criminalization with no exceptions for abortion. So bills that we've seen in the past that would have gained a majority support, such as access to IVF, access to contraception, being opposed by these abolitionists in state houses. We just had a bill passed recently that is going to expand contraceptive access to 6 months at pharmacies, and we saw it be opposed and debated against on the state Senate floor because the abolitionist senators said and believed that birth control was an abortifacient. So these are the kind of discussions that is happening in the Oklahoma state legislature, discussions that we never thought would have happened in the past. So we also know that these abolitionists are incredibly savvy organizers, and they are going to take whatever it takes to start trying to move the conversation and shift it even further to the right when it comes to more mainstream acceptable ideas of IVF and access to contraception. But we also know that the reproductive freedom movement is powerful, and it has deep roots in organizing with an unwavering belief in autonomy and freedom and dignity, and that we are able to push back. In fact, that we have to push back against this movement.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It is really great to hear your perspective from the local sphere and how that affects your specific policy work. So I am going to pass it to Jessica now to just talk about next steps and then get into our Q&A.
Thank you very much. And as folks have questions for our panelists, please feel free to enter them into the questions section. You can plug in to future Repro Action campaigns by signing up for alerts at reproaction.org or following us on social media. We are at Repro Action across social media platforms. And save the date for our next webinar. Immigration is always a reproductive justice issue. That'll take place on Wednesday, June 25th at noon. We did this topic back in 2018, so it is very much time for a refresher. So please save that. All right, and now we will get into the Q&A section. So the first question is for Cindy. It's pretty specific, and it is, do you know who the leader of AHA in Oklahoma was when they were formed in 2011?
I do not have it in front of me, but if you give me about 2 minutes and get back to me, I can get you the name for that.
Awesome, thank you. Um, and Cindy, you talked about this a little bit, but I want to open it up either back to you or over to Madeline. So there's been an overarching discussion about how the end of Roe didn't just not satisfy the abortion abolitionists; it didn't satisfy the quote more mainstream anti-abortion groups too, because if it did, all the discussion of, oh, let's leave it back to the states would have dropped when Roe fell. However, of course, we have seen an increase in more aggressive anti-abortion legislation. And I wanted to ask further what type of impact this has had on birth control and fertility care, as we've seen both the previous example, Cindy, that you gave in regards to birth control access up to 6 months. We also saw a reintroduction of removing the FACE Act, which is a federal protection of reproductive health care clinics, the same week that there was a bombing at a fertility clinic. So I just wanted to open it up to Cindy and Madeline. Could you talk a little bit more about either other examples that you're seeing that started in maybe the abolitionists group regarding birth control and fertility care that has sort of leaked more into the broader discussion, is now much more cause for concern?
Madeline, I didn't know if you wanted to take this, but I also got the name of the leader of the AHA in Norman. His name is Tony Lauinger. But back to that previous question, yes, not only are we seeing this impact access to contraceptive access, because again, like I said, it was a green light whenever Roe was overturned that they were not only going to stop at abortion, that they were going to go after contraceptive access as well as IVF access. We had a bill that was introduced this year to try to expand the access to IVF, and then unfortunately it never got a second in committee, and we never thought that would have happened a few years ago, but because of the public pressure that lawmakers are facing, they are either voting no or refusing to support bills that would have had their support in the past.
Yeah, I can just add a little bit to that, but I think Cindy is exactly right. There are a few different places that we've seen this. One thing I will say, as I said before, is right, none of this is new. We've always had to fight this misleading, unscientific messaging that contraception are abortifacients, or that certain versions of contraception are abortifacients. And that shows up in legislation or in legislative fights fairly frequently. I think we are likely to see more efforts to restrict access to certain types of contraception. We're also seeing sort of the beginnings of what we saw in anti-abortion work, with young people's access to contraception being limited, or their ability to consent to this care. And that's not driven so specifically by abortion abolitionists, but I bring it up because we know that that is sort of the next wave of this fight, or likely to be coming, and we're already starting to see the workings of that. Specifically in terms of where we've seen abolitionists impact access to IVF. So you may remember last spring there was a huge fallout in Alabama after the state Supreme Court's decision in a case called LePage that applied personhood language in the Alabama state constitution to a wrongful death provision that actually shut down fertility services in the state for a time. And there was a huge back and forth among anti-abortion legislators and folks who were more, again, mainstream versus more abolitionist oriented about how to fix or whether to fix that situation, and it hasn't been fixed. I also thought that we would see a wave of legislation this session or right after that Alabama decision in other states aimed at protecting IVF care, and we've seen some, but not nearly as much as I expected, particularly in states with hostile legislatures, I think in no small part because of the dynamics that Cindy identified. So we're seeing not just barricades to expanding access, but also a sort of refusal to respond appropriately to current barriers, and a willingness to think about other restrictive measures. So the other thing I will say is that there was a bill in Arkansas this past session that passed that was advancing this, again, unscientific, misleading concept of quote unquote restorative reproductive medicine, which is something that has been pushed by people who oppose IVF and other assisted fertility services as a potential sort of replacement service. And it's that kind of anti-science work that is driven very much by folks who oppose abortion and who want to treat fetuses and embryos as full people, that again just kind of starts to push ineffective anti-scientific methodologies in other areas of healthcare, including fertility.
Thank you so much for sharing that. My next question is, could Sydney, Madeline, or even Nagar expand a little bit upon the tactics used by abortion abolitionists, specifically the overarching trend through that I've been seeing through this webinar of aggression, following people's children to schools in order to stand outside, and can you all expand a little bit upon the sort of what I'm hearing is threat of violence that some of these folks are participating in?
Cindy, I don't know if you want to take that one.
Sure, yeah. So mainly the largest groups on the national level that we are seeing, especially on social media, is the Abolitionist Rising group. And sometimes I debate if I should watch the YouTube videos that they post so I can know what's really going on and where they're going to showing up. But I think a lot of us organizers can only take so much in the algorithm that would be impacted by that. But they are very savvy organizers. They do use people power. So they can send out social media messages, they can send out emails and text messages to thousands of people at the drop of a hat. And they have a dedicated group of followers and organizers that will show up to different state houses, whether that is staying outside to protest lawmakers walking in the door, or they will literally follow them around the state house, harassing them, asking them why they are voting a certain way. They do not care what letter is by your name. Oftentimes they will protest Republican lawmakers as well. Again, we have seen them protest right outside of the churches and places of worship of legislators, go to public schools, and their tactics are incredibly savvy in that they know if they show up to different GOP meetings that legislators are holding, that they can publicly embarrass them in front of their colleagues, and really risk the political career of that legislator if they don't start voting the way that they would like them to. So even if you have a Republican senator or representative that is willing to vote the way that is morally correct and defend abortion access, as little as it may seem, they are taking a risk when they do that, and they are risking potential acts of violence and harassment and intimidation, even if they vote the way you would like them to. So we are not only seeing that intimidation at the state house level, but we are also seeing it on the national level as well.
Thank you, Cindy, for that answer. I appreciate it. I would like to end with a question, hopefully more of a positive note. Cindy, Madeline, whoever would like to take this first, please go ahead. But and both of you have touched on this a bit through the questions, but how can we combat this increased abortion stigma and the rhetoric that's being pushed out by abortion abolitionists?
I can go ahead and start, although I'm really interested to hear what Cindy has to say based on her local organizing also. I think the thing that I think about a lot with anti-abortion legislation and organizing is this desire or effort to really isolate pregnant people, to leave them with nowhere to turn, to make people too scared to offer help or support, financial support or just emotional support, information. And so one, I think, very easy but extremely important thing that we can continue to do is to be a safe place for people to turn, to offer that help, to be volunteering with funds, to be working at your, at nearby clinics, to be making clear to people that you support their ability to make these decisions for themselves and that you will help them access the care that they need. That's a huge piece. And then the other piece, of course, is to tell your elected officials that you support this care, that you support pregnant people, that you support abortion, and that you want them to as well. Say it over and over again, say it loudly, call them, protest, march. It's really important that our legislators, even those who, disagree with us or who are going to vote for an abortion ban over and over again, understand that when they take those steps, they're doing it against the will of the public and their constituents, and that those decisions and that legislation is unpopular. So those would be my two pieces.
And I am happy to just echo everything that Madeline said. I loved what you said about, I think the first step is taking care of our neighbors, making sure that they have what they need, but also knowing, and I will say it until the cows come home, that local elections really do matter. And there are going to be tons of folks who may say, what does a school board district election have to do with abortion access? But in Oklahoma and other states, there was a bill that would have forced public school districts to display an anti-abortion video that had misinformation and was misleading from live action. And we were able to work with local organizers and school districts, but the bill fortunately did not fully pass, but if it did, it would have been up to the school districts to vote whether or not they were going to show those type of videos. So again, abortion access starts at every single level, not just on the state and national level, but we can really start looking at school boards, city councils, legislative seats, and what all of these folks have to do with abortion access. So it always starts, I think, on the local level, and knowing that we can make change even in our own small corner of the world.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Cindy and Madeline, for joining us today, sharing your expertise and knowledge with us. It is greatly appreciated. Thank you to Nagar for organizing this and putting this together. And thank you to our attendees for joining in. I hope everybody has a great rest of their Tuesday, and take care, everybody. Bye.